Hello, I'm Robert McDermott. I'm a retired professor from the California Institute of Integral Studies. And especially, I'm a retired professor from the program of Philosophy, Cosmology, and Consciousness. Like this, a very special, smaller unit inside of a larger unit. The same way I think I'm not so much a Californian, but I've become a San Francisco. And I'm not really a former citizen of New York State so much as I am of New York City, where I was born, where I grew up, where I was educated, at least through undergraduate. And then my wife and I lived 20 years in Westchester, which is also sort of an adjunct of New York City. So I'm a New Yorker as well as a San Franciscan. And I'm being interviewed because at one point, thanks to an astonishing privilege that I can hardly remember or hardly admit to, because it sounds so dramatic, and I'd like to present it in such a way that it doesn't maintain that sort of awesome quality. The gratitude should be there, but it's not as though Owen Barfield and I went around lecturing and teaching together. What happened is very specific. Namely, I was a new president of the Rudolf Steiner Institute that met for 3 weeks every summer in an institution that we rented. In this case, it was at Wilson College, and I had a close friend at Wilson College, Harry Buck. He was the secretary of the American Academy of Religion. No, I was the secretary. What was he? He was something else. He was some kind of a director of the National Association of Professors of Religion. And I was young, and he was sort of mid-career or past mid-career. And the Rudolf Steiner Institute was looking to move from Massachusetts, where it rented a college in Natick every year from the time it was founded in 1975. And so as a new president, I had just moved it to Wilson College, thanks to my friend Harry Buck. And so we had the idea that we would have a kind of a star, some really distinguished anthroposophist come and give the Rudolf Steiner Institute lecture. The year before, the first time we had such a person, we had Stuart Easton, who was also a friend of the former president and me. And he gave some wonderful lectures. He was a great lecturer. And then we had Owen Barfield, and I'm sorry, I can't remember when I first met Owen Barfield, and was it then? I do remember that I brought Owen Barfield to Baruch College, part of the City University of New York, where I was chair of the philosophy department. But I can't remember. I should have kept a diary for such purposes. Anyway, I wrote to Owen Barfield probably in the winter and said, we would love you to be the Rudolf Steiner Institute Fellow and to give a lecture that you would prepare, and maybe we'll publish it, and who knows. Of course, everything that Owen Barfield ever wrote or said was intended it should have been published, because there are people who know about Barfield just have a tremendous interest, intense and devotional, just, oh, Owen Barfield, that is a kind of a hush because he was so special. Anyway, he came and gave this lecture. That was uncomplicated. What was complicated was that he wrote really just before we opened, sometime probably early July, and said, as I'm now 85, I really can't count on compos mentis or something, being able to teach. so you should give the course. His mistakenly thinking that I knew his thoughts so well. Not so. For one thing, Owen Barfield is so difficult for ordinary people like me. So anyway, he wrote and said, now that I'm 85, you should give the course. And so I wrote back and said, will you be at my side if I try to give a course on saving the appearances? And I think the second book was What Coleridge Thought. I don't know why I chose that, or why he chose that. In any case, I sat at the head of the table, and there were maybe a dozen students that we met every day for Monday to Friday for 3 weeks. It was a challenge, to say the least, because Owen's language is very elegant and so refined. It's hard to repeat a sentence that's beautiful, long and complex with phrases that are tucked away as qualifiers and nuance and all these terribly British things. I mean, the moment that occurs to me, thinking about it now, with some amount of astonishment, is somebody would ask, well, what does this mean, or does that mean such and such or such and such? And I would say what I thought it meant, and then I would turn to Owen, and everyone calls him Owen, like Thomas Berry. Everybody says Thomas, so as though we were best friends. Well, in a way, to be near him was to feel like you're his friend because he was so kind. So I would turn to Owen, having just attempted to answer this question, and I would say, so Owen, what do you think? Is that a good explanation? And then I picture him taking his pipe out of his mouth, but he probably wasn't smoking during class, but he was often with a pipe. If you see photographs of him, you'll probably see him with a pipe. This is the quintessence of 20th century British. All right, so he would then pause for a moment and say, well, yes, you could say that. Yeah, I can see why you would say that, yes, of course. But on the other hand, you really could say quite the opposite, couldn't you? Which is another incredibly Barfieldian kind way of saying, actually, McDermott, you really don't know what you're talking about. But anyway, it was so kind and so wonderful, so inspiring that's what I remember more than I remember anything about that. The other moment I remember was that toward the end, I said, Owen, it's been such a privilege to be with you and to teach you with you, etc. Would you be willing to inscribe one of your books? He said, yes, of course. Bring it to my room. So I did, and I brought, no, that's Saving the Appearances. I want to find, I don't even see it now. Okay, doesn't matter. It is called here it is, On Ancestral Voice, which is not an ordinary title, you'll agree. But of course, it is about, closer, yeah, okay. On Ancestral Voice. So, of course, the blurbs on the back, the first one, T.S. Eliot, an excursion into seas of thought which are very far from ordinary routes of intellectual shipping. Perfect Eliot, perfect Barfield. Yeah, so I won't read what he said, even though it's tempting. But I said to him, this is my favorite book of yours, because almost anybody would say Saving the Appearances, which is his most well-known book. But anyway, maybe I was being a little clever or whatever. So I brought An Ancestral Voice, and he said that it was also his favorite book, which I really liked a lot, which is why, of course, I'm saying it now. Anyway, anything to do with Owen makes me want to remember it. It makes me want to. So I wrote an autobiographical essay. It included my meeting with him and then teaching with him. And I said, I still can't believe that I knew him. It's so amazing that, and yet to be with him, he lets you think that you're the important person. It's just exquisite, this ability. So on my way I was part of a conference or a seminar that ran for 3 weeks at Esalen, or 2 weeks at Esalen, and the third week was at St. John's College, Cambridge, and it was kind of a who's who of the Bay Area, and I was invited by either Michael Murphy or Houston Smith. It could easily have been Michael Murphy, whom I knew because I knew Haridas Chaudhuri, the founder of CIIS, which will be a part of this interview. So I'm telling you that because it was in early August, and my birthday is August 5th. In fact, it was my 50th birthday. And so I wrote to him and said, could I visit you for my birthday? Well, of course he wrote back and said, oh yes, I'd be delighted. And so I then went with him on the way to St. John's College. I just went to, was it called something like Hatch? Has the word Hatch in it? Don't know. It's a retirement home where he lived, I think maybe the last 10 years of his life. Very comfortably, it seemed, very relaxed and settled. It was, as I pictured, it was one room in a retirement home, surrounded by books, and people coming and interviewing him and talking to him, and etc. Like in this book, Simon Blackstone DeLang, yes, Romanticism Comes of Age, a great title. He talks about, was it he or was it no, it might have been Andrew Welburn, two great authors, two great experts on Barfield, talking about how they would go and just spend maybe 2 hours asking him questions. Well, what did you think about this? And why did you write that? And et cetera, et cetera. And his memory was wonderful, probably until the end. So anyway, I can't stop now to do all the figuring how old he was, but I know I was 50. Anyway, I had that birthday with him, and as I remember riding the train up to Cambridge, St. John's College, feeling there now. That was sort of an archetypal moment that was a touching to greatness, to depth, to integrity, to brilliance. At that time, I didn't know that he spent half his time as a poet, but now I do. From Jeffrey Hippolito, who also writes poetry, which I do not, that Owen spent half of his time writing poetry. And Jeff Hippolito, who's a Barfield scholar, has a book reviewed in the latest, here it is, just came, the latest image of this anthroposophical magazine called Being Human. Quite an interesting title, Being Human. Anyway, it's most atypical. And there's a picture of Rudolf Steiner and Bertie Steiner in, sort of boarding a train or something like that. You never see a photo like that. Anyway, it's in that issue that Jeff Hippolito has an essay, and also there's a review by don't go away, Fred Dennehy, also an expert on Owen Barfield. In fact, he has a son named Owen after Owen Barfield. I thought that was very sweet. I remember when I lived in New York, I knew that. Okay, shouldn't wander too wildly. So now, where am I? Or not so much who am I, but where am I in the career and in knowing how did it happen? Well, I was president of the Steiner Institute for, I guess, a dozen years. And so as a result, I knew these very prominent anthroposophists who were happy to come to the Steiner Institute for 3 weeks and teach 200 people from around the country and faculty from around the world. It was a great institution. I've sometimes said it was, until I became chair of the board of the Sophia Project, which I admired tremendously, it was my favorite. The Rudolf Steiner Institute was my favorite institution. It was really wonderful. Okay, so I was a professor in New York. I thought, quite ordinary, but I loved teaching at Baruch. Well, first at Manhattanville College, kind of fancy college for Catholic women. I think of them as daughters of Republican bankers, but also they had great conscience. They would go down on Friday night. They would go down to the Catholic Worker, and we were all involved with protesting the war, the Vietnam War. I was the faculty advisor to the SDS, Students for Democratic Society, which was an organization I didn't especially like because it was so anti-intellectual. Yeah, I mean, kind of aggressively. I was kind of curious. Anyway, they were wonderful students, and I love them, and I'm still friends with some of them. Then in 1970, I guess September 71, I left, mostly because by that time, my wife Ellen and I had 2 children, and the Manhattanville salary wasn't so great. And so I went to the City University of New York. I won't mention the salary because it was so ridiculous. But it was another institution which I also loved and treated me very, very well. I was the chair of the philosophy department, and I was chair of the religion and culture department, and a lot of good things happened, wonderful things, really. And then in it's hard to get all these dates straight. At one point, I discovered, in the 70s, I was part of a grant at Syracuse University where I discovered Sri Aurobindo. And it's I'm a student of karma. I just love tracking karma. So here I am sitting in this room with the other grantees, and a professor is lecturing on the first was the political, Gandhi and somebody named Aurobindo Ghosh, all right, about whom I had not heard ever before. But it was a great week on those figures and independence and colonialism, etc., which I knew a little bit about. That's how I got the grant. If I didn't know anything, I wouldn't have gotten it. And then in the 8th week, somebody came in and talked about the religious thinkers and spoke about not Aurobindo Ghosh, but Sri, namely esteemed. You could say Mr., but really it's more than Mr. Sri Aurobindo. So I'm listening to this lecture, and it's very exciting, and who he was, and his yoga, and being inspired to go down to French India and begin an ashram, and then as of French, somewhat Jewish, somewhat Turkish, a woman, occult, spiritual teacher comes and joins with him. And I said, wow, this is really interesting. So I went up to the professor afterwards and said, so the first or second week we heard about this revolutionary, so is this the same guy? And he says, yeah, the first half is radical political, and the second half is mystical, spiritual poetry, philosophy. So I was just then, I guess I was just finishing my dissertation, about to defend or something like that. And I said, this is my first book for sure. How does a serious revolutionary, educated in England, brilliantly, educated in England, really a great academic career, come home and become a thorn in the side of the British, how he gets jailed for a year, where he has an experience of Krishna, and it's a fabulous story. I said, oh, this is my first book. Okay, so then what happened? The second summer was in India. So I went to India and studied for 8 weeks the way I was to do so, part of the grant. And then I went to the Sri Aurobindo Ashram down in Pondicherry, southeast India, which was controlled by the French before independence. And there I met these quite prominent Aurobindo disciples, Bob Lawler and some other people. And so then I went back to New York, still a professor at Baruch, and starting to lecture about Sri Aurobindo and writing pretty steadily, writing something or other. It was for Sri Aurobindo's centenary, 1972. So I wrote an essay for various publications. But in the meantime, in 1970, I had met Haridas Chaudhuri, the founder of the California Institute of what was then called Asian Studies, which was a good name, but they changed it to Integral Studies, first off, that's the word that Sri Aurobindo gave to his philosophy. So it was also a good name. Anyway, I knew Haridas, and Haridas and I published together in honor of the centenary in 1972. This is now a long time ago, 72 to like 50 years ago. Okay, and then the next act, which in a certain sense is the rest of my life, namely, I had a Fulbright to go to England. Actually, it was given to me. You can't really give away a Fulbright, but Thomas Berry, who is a friend and a teacher, wrote to the Fulbright people and said, I don't really want to do this, but I have this young scholar who'd be good. Why don't you get him? And so next thing I was in England at the Open University, writing a little book on Gandhi and Aurobindo, and also making a video about Sri Aurobindo, the avatar, concept and example. And I worked with an Irish filmmaker named Nuala O'Phelan. We were good friends, and really enjoyed doing that video. People say that when they hear it, they say, oh yeah, that's the film you made with an English accent. Oh, I did not. They say, oh yes, you did. Anyway, so I then became an amateur exponent of Sri Aurobindo. Of Rudolf Steiner, who is Sri Aurobindo, sort of for the West. And ever since I've had these two, one early, one later, but these two amazing figures who, and one of the parts that's amazing is that some people don't know who they are. I'm thinking, how could you not know? He wrote 350, well, he didn't write 350 books, but his writing and lectures have been collected in 350 volumes. You may be able to see them behind me. Anyway, that's half of them. So Rudolf Steiner then just, well, I already warned you that I think in terms of karma, that I didn't feel that just out of nothing I made this decision. I was responding. I was being lured. I was being kind of not dragged at all, but invited, allowed, privileged, invited to be in this teaching, in this, which was not teaching that was totally different from everything else. It was very similar. It was similar to Sri Aurobindo, or to Hegel, or to Plato, or to interpretations of the New Testament, and his lectures on the Bhagavad Gita, which I then edited. So that then became my spiritual home. And when I wasn't trying to think those thoughts, I was nevertheless being visited by Rudolf Steiner thoughts, by anthroposophical thoughts that anthropos, human, and Sophia, divine feminine. And that's another part that I came to love about Sri Aurobindo, namely that he had this deep devotion and affirmation to the divine feminine, to Sophia, just as Sri Aurobindo wrote about the mother, the Mira Richard was the name of her second husband, but she really should go by Mira Alfasa, or really the mother, the name that he gave, Aurobindo gave to her, as a way of indicating that she was a manifestation of the divine feminine. So they both, Sri Aurobindo and Rudolf Steiner, have a deep commitment to this idea of the divine feminine. And in the case of Sri Aurobindo, the manifestation is this woman who he said was his equal and his collaborator. And Rudolf Steiner has the divine feminine that he traces from Isis, who was the goddess of the Mediterranean world for 3,000 years. Yes, 3,000 years. And, of course, the manifestation of the divine feminine in Mary, the mother of Jesus, who is invited to be the mother, and the Holy Spirit would overshadow her. Then she had this astonishing life of being constantly surprised by who this child was, and then who this young adult was, and then who became the teacher to these people who you sometimes want to shake, like, did you hear what he said? Pay attention. No, he didn't do that. And of course, that's still the case, that we don't get what we should get. Anyway, he was the great teacher. And then it turns out when he was baptized, and then that goes to another level, and then he was opposed because he upset the establishment, and then he was worse than opposed. He was crucified, and then there's a whole amazing story about his apparitions to people. And you might want to pay attention to the fact that a woman who had massaged Jesus' hair with expensive oils. She came from a wealthy family. She was a sister of Lazarus. They were wealthy followers of Jesus. And then Judas objects and says that lotion could have been sold and sold, and the money could have been used for the poor. And John puts in the gospel, he didn't say that because he cared about the poor. He cared about that because he cared about money. There's wonderful lines in John's gospel, which is another level, really, from Matthew, Mark, and Luke, which are, of course, fabulous, astonishing documents. But John is another level, I think. Okay, Steiner recited the prologue. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. That long, beautiful, page-and-a-half prologue, every day, out loud, standing. He also said the Our Father the same way, the Lord's Prayer. Okay, I shouldn't ramble. Now, Barfield. So let's see. Then we have to, I guess, I don't know where we are in the chronology, but in 1983, as I told you at the beginning, I was president of the Rudolf Steiner Institute. I invited Owen. Owen came. We sort of taught together, which sounds like I was this great expert, which of course I wasn't, because I remember saying then and still, Barfield's really hard. I like History, Guilt, and Habit because it's a lecture. The 3 lectures, actually, but especially the first lecture, Evolution of, is that what it's called? Anyway.
History of Ideas, Evolution of Consciousness.
Yeah, it's called Evolution of Consciousness, yeah. And it's quite readable and memorable. You should try it. Okay, so where are we? Then in 1983, I was offered the presidency of CIIS, 1983, so that would have been 7 or 8 years after the death of Haridas Chaudhuri, who was a friend. I was a younger friend of his, and greatly admired him and greatly admired the institution that he founded, and and was president of, he and his wife Bina. But it wasn't right for my family for all kinds of reasons, and the school wasn't that admirable in a certain sense. It was quite unpleasant. There were lots of arguments and suspicions and divisions and etc. Kind of 60s leftover, ideological and such. And I turned it down. But then in 1990, after having gone to that Esalen Revisioning Philosophy Conference, invited by Michael Murphy probably, then I was offered again through a whole very curious circumstance with lots of, I would say, interventions that made the offer possible. And then the person who hired me to teach at Manhattanville in 1964, Elizabeth McCormick, had by this time become the closest associate of Lawrence Rockefeller. Yeah, and so I called her and I said, I've been offered this job. And she said, well, you can't take that. And I said, well, I sort of knew I was a friend of the president who was deceased, and I really admire the school. I just, it seems right. And she said, well, if you insist, I'll introduce you to Lawrence. And so I then came and met Lawrence Rockefeller up in the 56th floor of Rockefeller Center, in the same building where I had delivered shirts and ties when I was working at a haberdasher after high school at Charles Dillon, 7 East 55th Street. This was 50th and 5th. I just love that part of town. Maybe I'm a snob, but I just love it. Anyway, Lawrence couldn't have been more gracious, so really kind. And so he said, oh, yes, and I've been wanting to meet you, and etc. And then we sat I think we sat on a Wednesday, and then a Thursday, then Friday, by which time he had his questions answered, and said, well, what are you going to do about this offer? Are you going to take it? And I said, I very much want to, Lawrence. I don't know if I can be up to this position. I've never been president before, and it's a very under-endowed school. And he said, well, how much would you need to make it work? And I said, well, I have a political brother who knows a lot about budgets, and I met with him, and he said, I'll need $6 million. And so Lawrence said, well, they'll kill me inside, by which he meant the money people in his office. If I give Robert, he said to Elizabeth, if I give Robert $6 million. So then there was a silence. I said, well, I thought to myself, that takes care of that. But then he said, so Elizabeth, do you think Robert can do this, can save this school and make it work for $5 million? And Elizabeth said, I think we should give it a try, Lawrence. And he said, well, all right then. And then he said, so will you take the job now that it's been offered to you? I said, well, my wife and I have talked about it, and we really want to do it. And then he put his finger out as though it was stretching yards across the room, and he said, that's what I wanted to hear. So next thing you know, we were on the train from Grand Central Station to Oakland to become president of a quite fractious but admirable school, under-endowed, high ideals, wonderfully inventive, creative, all kinds of good things. And then I got a chance to meet with Lawrence Rockefeller up in the top floor where he had a room in the Huntington Hotel looking down on Grace Cathedral, and the Fairmont Hotel, and a park, a wonderful, wonderful place. And he said, you'll need some prominent faculty. I said, yes. I said, I will, or we will. And I said, and I really would like to bring this man, Richard Tarnas, the author of this new book, Passion of the Western Mind, which I then showed to Lawrence, and he said, well, this looks serious. I said, Lawrence, it's a beautiful book and wonderfully written. And he said, well, why don't you invite him then? which of course I did. And Rick then founded this program that some of us love so much called Philosophy, Cosmology, and Consciousness, which, as Rick said, he created the program that he would like to have taken when he graduated from Harvard and instead went to Esalen. But if he had had that program, he might have done that. Okay, so I then did that for 10 years. And then Elizabeth called a meeting of the board and said, well, Robert's done, at that point, 9 years, and what should happen next? And she had already asked me, of course, and she turned to me and said, well, what do you think? I said, I think I'm pretty tired. The faculty's pretty tired of me. Why don't we try somebody else? So we then appointed Joe Subiando, who was president for 17 years, and bought the building, which I had not been able to do. And the school has gone on, and it's more respectable, more legitimate, a little more corporate. When I was president, the accreditors came every couple of years to check, and expecting to find something lamentable or needing to be fixed. And the last report of the accreditors was just overwhelming with praise and compliments. So the school, no school stands still, no institution, no family, they all change. It's not as strong on the mission as it once was, but now it has a very respectable endowment. It has a president who's an economist, which was my weakest area, obviously. So it's a great story. You really could learn a lot studying just that one institution. When did the different groups, to what extent have they understood each other? To what extent have they complemented each other, made the one or the other, making the collaboration work for the institution? And to what extent did they miss, working out of old prejudices or fears? A lot of fear, myself included. A lot of fear. Is the school going to survive? In the late 90s, we didn't have an endowment, and we couldn't make payroll. Terrifying. And Lawrence and Elizabeth flew out, and we had lunch with Bob Graham, a very fine financial person who was finance chair of the board, a good friend of mine. So we sat in this little table in this little cafe in the CIIS dining room. Not a dining room, it's a cafe, it's a coffee shop. Anyway, Lawrence, some of these moments are quite vivid in my mind. Lawrence, after hearing the extent of the financial struggles, he turned to Bob Graham and he said, well, you be my barometer. If you give, I'll give. I'll match you. And Bob said, okay, I'll give. I think he gave $100,000. And Lawrence said, I'll give $100,000. And Elizabeth said, I'll give $50,000. And next thing you know, we had a decent amount of money. And more than that, confidence was restored. Because with these financial things, they're never just financial. They're also psychological and ultimately spiritual. But even if you can't see that, you should be able to see that it's psychological. It has to do with, are you doing okay? Are you going to make it? Do you know how to get money? Do you know how to spend money? And do you know how to make the money be the safe description, really, the safe inner dimension of the educational effort, which I knew that needed to be done. I'm not sure that I did well enough. I shouldn't have been in that budget deficit in the first place. I should have seen it coming and didn't. Anyway, all of those institutions that were competitors of ours in the Bay Area, 4 of them have gone out of business or completely lost their mission, their spiritual, psychological mission. Yeah, the one down in the peninsula has survived, but also has had terrible troubles. Yeah, these are hard institutions. The big institutions that have endowments sometimes have trouble having any purpose, having any depth, having any personality, whereas CIS has, I sometimes think it doesn't just have a history, it has a biography. It's like a living entity. It has a depth dimension that is hard to see if you're not good at seeing, but you can, it is visible, it can be seen and it can be served, but that takes a special effort. Anyway, so one time, I guess it was in the 90s, it was in 1995, I remember, and I sent Owen a copy of something that Rick Tarnas had written. I don't this minute remember what it was, but it was something that he did as an address, probably some kind of a Jungian, C.G. Jung conference. I sent it to him with something that I wrote, 95, I don't know what it was. And he wrote back at age 95 in a aerogram, one of these blue pages. It was perfectly legible, handwritten, and he says something like, and thank you for these two pieces that I've read with pleasure, I think he said. And it has given me the thought, once again, that CIIS might, by that time the name was changed, to IS, integral, that CIS might be a reason for hope as we look to the future in a dark time. Well, he could have been writing it yesterday or today, but it was such a compliment and such a, I sort of, this is Owen Barfield, Did you hear me? There was a retreat recently when Rick Tarnas and Brian Swim and I were being celebrated for our retirement, and I read that paragraph, and people said, wow, Owen Barfield wrote that. So lots of people say, who's that? But other people say, you don't know Owen Barfield? He's one of the Inklings. He's friend and collaborator of Tolkien and C.S. Lewis and Charles Williams, and Lewis said he was the wisest of his critics. It annoyed Barfield a little bit, to the extent that he ever got annoyed that C.S. Lewis never read a word of Steiner. And this is the most important source of ideas that in Barfield, that he says in every book. He says, what I'm saying here, I learned from Steiner. But of course, a lot of people would like to read Barfield and not Steiner, because he's not, he is not the spiritual teacher of the age. He's the second level spiritual teacher of the age. So that's all, fascinating that people can. Barfield is more accessible, and you don't have this constant feeling that you're reading somebody who is almost transmitting, from an initiating source. I mean, so Steiner was initiated as the spiritual teacher of the time, the one who's going to get spirit back into matter and history to make sense, and not sense, but history to make spiritual insight, and that we will have global ideals instead of narrow ideas. And so the last 5 years of his life after the war, after the First World War, he was just pouring forth his fabulous spiritual, esoteric understanding in ways that were practical with respect to agriculture, economics, social structures, democracy, interpretation of the scriptures, just a tremendous outpouring of practical applications of his spiritual esoteric understanding. And so Barfield went and heard Steiner. I think Barfield was 21, or it might have been 1921, one or the other. And he just recognized that Steiner his teacher was looking for. Interestingly, Barfield then was the friend of these fabulous people, but he himself was not offered a position. And people often say, oh, that's because he stuttered. But I don't know if that's a sufficient reason, because his stutter wasn't that bad. I mean, like, I can hear him lecturing, and all those sentences were clear and, in fact, beautiful. And I wonder whether it had to do with Steiner. After all, probably the most influential of that group of four, or five or six, but certainly group of four. It's a beautiful book called Fellowship about the four of them. Maybe that C.S. Lewis, as he didn't read Steiner, may have told something to somebody about Owen's a lovely man and a dear friend and wisest and most brilliant of any of us. And this thing about Steiner, I'm not so sure about that. Don't know. I'm only guessing. Don't quote me as somebody who knows this, but you can quote me as somebody who suspects that, book after book of learning with insights and references to Jung and Campbell or Watts or whoever does not mention Steiner. I always go to the index and I always go down. He's not there. He should be there. Not only, so theosophical books on reincarnation, right, has these huge selections of writers on rebirth, for example, reincarnation, and no mention of Steiner, even though Steiner gave over 100 lectures on what happens after death. They knew all that. Steiner had been the German language teacher of theosophy for 10 years, 1902 to 1912, but they don't include it. It's a little bit outside the guardrail. A little bit. Some things he says, I don't know. It may not. People won't understand. Something. There are phrases for this. So that's one of the curious things about Steiner, is that just as, and almost because some people are so devoted, other people are not just not devoted, but resistant and sort of a little bit. But of course they were mean to Blavatsky too. Terrible. The Society for Psychical Research, with William James as one of the founders and one of the directors, let someone go over and write a report on Madame Blavatsky, which was false, horrendously false. And that stayed for 100 years until the society withdrew it and said that there was no reason, there was no evidence that she was a fraud. But practically in every encyclopedia in print said Madame Blavatsky, who was found guilty of fraud. So actually, as hard as it was on Steiner, and it was hard, and it is hard, the resistance, the fear that we might say something outside the paradigm, outside what we call evidence, which of course is a construct completely, that what we count as evidence is arbitrary. It's not unimportant. It's arbitrary. It doesn't have to be as strict as it is thought to be or articulated to be. A fascinating topic having to do with the relationship between science and epistemology and etc. And Steiner is in that endeavor at a very high level, but it's hard. And then you might get over, and then he'll say, well, then there's also something about Buddha and Mars or something or other, and you say, oh, I'm out of here. That's understandable, but also regrettable, because we'd missed the chance to have this fabulous teacher. Barfield didn't do that. He had his own thought, and then he says, but I'm always influenced by Steiner. And then he sort of says to himself, and I wish you were too, because if you think I'm smart, you want to check the guy who gave 350 volumes that we're still learning from. So if you're interested in Barfield, I can only say you've got good taste. He is fabulously brilliant, learned. He's kind, almost beyond belief. You just say, wow, he's really that kind. He's really that gentle. He's so thoughtful, and he just takes his pipe out. Oh, yes, you could say that. So we had, here in PCC, we had a visit by his grandson, Owen A. Barfield, who gave a terrific talk on Barfield and stirred up a lot of interest. And this Barfield actually has a pretty prominent place in philosophy, cosmology, and consciousness. Ashton Arnold wrote a 300-page dissertation. Oh my goodness, 300 pages on Barfield. That's wonderful.
400.
Huh?
400.
400.
Yeah.
That's not true. It didn't.
It
Oh
is
no.
true, unfortunately.
I'm glad I wasn't your mentor.
Yeah.
No, I wouldn't. I would have been. It would have. I was retired already. But anyway, Barfield. Jake Sherman is a real Barfield expert, and this Barfield has been discovered and is being sustained more than I would have imagined. It's wonderful to be sort of to. The world is not as bad as you think, if you as you would have thought, or did think, once you contemplate Barfield, that he just kept writing these books, living very modestly, very, very gently, and then just giving a collection of lectures or letters or such learning. It's Coleridge and Goethe and, oh my goodness, it's really a privilege to be in his shadow, as sort of to carry his book bag. Okay, so I hope you got something about Steiner and Barfield from this. I suppose I should say rambling, but I hope it's not too rambling. It's a role. Because it's an inspiring topic. I could just go on and on, but I won't. So thank you for listening. I appreciate it.